So recording is now in progress. I will just hopefully share my screen. Try again. Yeah, doesn't seem to want to do it. Let me just try something else. Bear with me a moment. Right, are we able to see that? Sean, can you see the?
Unfortunately not, Gareth.
Right.
I could try and give it a go from this end if you like.
Okay. Not sure what's going on there. Okay, give it a go your end.
Are you probably seeing my screen at this stage, are you?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll maximize our slides.
Okay, great. It's
still seeing that?
Yeah, it's worked for you.
Okay. So sorry about this. And it kind of mirrors some of the experiences I think we've all had during the pandemic, and trying to share our screens and not being quite successful with the technology, and then being able to kind of improvise slightly. So
can I slideshow there? Sure.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I was looking for that. Okay, so great stuff. Hopefully we'll.
It does look a bit odd. Yeah.
Okay. Are we there?
I think we are.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, over to you, Gareth.
Okay, thank you very much. So apologies for that slightly start. As Sean mentioned, it probably mirrors what's been going on a little bit in the last 18 months. So welcome everybody, and thanks for dropping in. I know you didn't have any choice. You were corralled into this particular area, but I do thank you for joining us. I have to say, in a sense, we're pretenders in a sense, because this research we actually did before the whole pandemic times. But we thought there was it raised some interesting issues that could be applied into pandemic type situations. And Patrick obviously thought the same thing too, because he was keen for the research to appear in the publication. So we thank Advanced HE for that. So we're looking at this title, Assessment Insights from the Margins, Garnering the Views of Disabled Learners Through Lesson Study. And Seán will talk very shortly about lesson study, and then I will talk briefly about some of the key findings, and then we'll open it out for your thoughts and discussions and so forth. So this research took place on an education studies degree here at the University of Worcester, and it took place with level 5 students, and it took place in a particular module that prepares them for their level 6 research. So it was a level 5 research methods module, and we identified, or students self-identified themselves. We asked students to self-identify. So we had 3 students who, for want of a better word, we might say were potentially marginalized, and that was from a variety of perspectives. They all did have a particular identified disability, but there were other issues as well, in terms of some social issues and also health issues. So we were keen to explore their experiences of the way that they were prepared for the assignments in this particular module. So that was what we were particularly interested in. How did they approach, and how did they find our approach towards the preparation for the students of working towards their assignments? So that's broadly speaking the background to the paper. Seán, I'll hand over to you at this point.
Great, thanks a lot for that, Gareth. So just to give you a little bit of an overview around lesson study, I think it's interesting that lesson study itself actually came about as a result of a calamity. And I think for that reason, it has resonance in terms of how it might be used kind of post-pandemic, during pandemic and post-pandemic times. It was actually introduced to us in the West via Japan, but in a strangely circuitous route, because it came about as a result of emerging Japanese educators in the 19th century coming to Camden, actually, of all places, to study, because they recognized that their splendid isolation was actually quite damaging for Japanese global interests, as it were. They were being pressurized by Britain and by the United States in terms of trade and whatnot. So what they wanted to do was to kind of figure out a learning strategy that would enable them to kind of catch up with some of the innovations that were taking place in the Western world. So they studied here in the UK and in the US and brought the ideas back to Japan. And what emerged was this notion of what we call in the West lesson study. And it's kind of built on constructivist ideas around learning and investigating learning. And what we were keen to reveal was the learning experiences of, as Gareth has identified, more marginalized learners, and getting a sense as to what their experiences were. And so they became that kind of focus group for us, and drawing on the work of Seán, for example, in relation to learner voice. And that's really interesting that that's the next topic for Patrick's forthcoming focus, is that learner voice. And we were keen to reveal that learner voice through lesson study. So the process itself it's quite structured, and it involves a joint planning of research lessons, generally with what's perceived as the teacher, who was Gareth at the time, and some, in inverted commas, external experts. And those external experts here were representatives from library and information studies, from student services, from myself as a kind of an academic who was somewhat familiar with lesson study. And I learned the process also from experts in the field like Professor Pete Dudley and Professor Bram Norwich, and I point you to their work in particular to kind of investigate further its applications to higher education, which is just emerging, actually. So it's a really interesting, I think, methodology to think about in relation to assessment, but also in relation to praxis and learning, and revealing how learning takes place. So you joint plan a lesson, you teach and observe that lesson, and then interview the learners afterwards about what their experiences were. And it was great having that diversity around the table in terms of interrogating the learner experience from the perspective of, as I mentioned, student services, library and information services, academic support services, and learning technologists as well. So there's a real scope for revealing what happens within the lesson sphere, and then drawing on the literature, drawing on sort of wider experiences to inform the next iteration of the lesson, so that there's a better attunement between learner requirements and actually what happens in that learner space. And there are generally 3 iterations of this. And then there's an idea at the end of this that you write up and present what you've discovered, and you conduct a public research lesson, so that the learning gets disseminated more widely. Or you engage in disseminations such as what we're about here this morning. So I'm really pleased that you're along to participate in this kind of iteration of that process. Gareth has mentioned that it was initiated around 2018, but it's still ongoing. And I think what's interesting about lesson study is that it lends itself to a diversity of contexts and situations. And I have to say that our partners in Brazil have really taken to this concept. There wasn't really much focus on lesson study in Brazil, or very few publications related to it until basically this project was supported by the British Academy. And as I mentioned, there's like quite a lot of interest in Brazil, and I guess within the United Kingdom, in relation to the applications of lesson studies, or potential applications of lesson studies. So back to the actual focus itself, and over to you, Gareth, and some of the findings.
Okay, thanks very much, Seán. So Seán's given a great overview there of lesson study and how it can be implemented. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the things that applying this methodology revealed for us as we attempted carrying it out in the context of the module that I've just talked about. So I've just popped one slide up there, which kind of summarizes the key points, I guess. And to begin with, as we were looking at the feedback that was coming back, both from the students who were the kind of subject of the study, and the partner staff who were in with us. And actually, let me just reiterate the point that Seán made. It was great to have individuals from library services and student services in the classroom. They really appreciated seeing what actually happens, and we really appreciated their insights. So I guess that's one thing I haven't really mentioned on this slide, but that cross-working across different departments was really interesting. But in terms of what we garnered from our observations regarding the students, we came up, I suppose, with this very heuristic rule of thumb, conceptual idea, I guess. And so we have in the left-hand column there, under perceptibility. So those things that are relatively easy for us to see as staff, down to those things that are more occluded, out of sight, hidden. And then across the top row there, proximity, those things that maybe are quite close to us, which we might be able to change or have some kind of agency over, to those things which perhaps we might have less ability as staff to actually influence. So this gave us a way of organizing some of the things that were coming back in the data. So quadrant one there is those things that were kind of close, which we might be able to change as staff, and which we could see relatively easily. So a lot of the information that came back from the students were things we might have expected. Students liked particular structures within the module. They liked the clarity of structures. Quality of teaching, of course, was important to them. The way in which they were engaged with the process, the way in which information and ideas were presented, in which materials were presented, all these were obviously important to them. They really appreciated the support that was on offer from those other departments within the university. And their classification in terms of disability, or we obviously, this is a debatable issue, but for them, having their disability identified and the appropriate support being given by the university was really important to them. Two there, so these are things that perhaps might not be so obvious to us, but if they become obvious, then we might be able to make some impact on them. And the students talked about the importance of the way in which feedback was given and how useful very instant or quick feedback was. And so, for example, they really appreciated little quizzes, if you like, pop quizzes, just to get them to recall what we've been doing in the previous session. So that mixture of instant feedback and longer term feedback, and the quality of the longer term feedback was obviously really important to them. That access to IT, including the skills to be able to use it, that was key to them. So some of them felt more skilled, I guess, in using some of the support that was available, some of the IT that was available, and some less so. The influence of peer groups, All three of our sample engaged with peer group discussion on WhatsApp and Facebook and so forth, and they were good at kind of mediating that engagement. If it became a negative space, they got out of it. If it was a positive space, they stayed in it. Quadrant 3 there. So that this might be something that, and you can debate these points, and it will vary depending on each particular context. But within our particular context, just put a couple of things in there which were, relatively easily discernible for us staff, for me as a lecturer. The impact of particular disability, and the social economic issues that might arise for some students. Now, of course, I might see that, but I might feel that these are things that I can actually have less direct or immediate impact on in terms of what I do to support. But the more I know about that as a member, as a teaching member of staff, the more useful that information can become, the more I might be able to adapt what I do. And then in quadrant 4 there, we have these things that are both further away from influence, if you like, further away from direct influence, and also perhaps more hidden unless you make the effort through something like lesson study. And it might not, there may be other ways of doing this, and maybe that's something we could explore in a few minutes. But these are things that came out that we would not necessarily have, or I would not necessarily have known about. So 3 little examples, one from each of the students. One of the students was a joint honours education studies and computer education student, and yet he had no particular IT that he himself used. He didn't have a smartphone, he didn't have a laptop that he used. He could have, but he, for various reasons, I won't go into those now, but he chose not to. So the expectations that I would have had of him and what he had access to and what he could use were actually incorrect. There was another student who had had really bad experiences from her school with regard to assessment, and both informal and formal. And she was very fearful of receiving very negative types of feedback. I don't mean in terms of the mark given necessarily, but just the way that people reacted to her. She'd had experience of being mocked and laughed at and being, highly criticized in very poor ways by teaching staff. So of course, that's not something we would have known about had we not explored it directly. Another student, very interesting, highly organized student, she deliberately didn't access materials in advance. Of course, we're all encouraged to put materials up in advance for students to access, particularly for those with perhaps specific learning difficulties. But she deliberately chose not to engage with those. And she gave for interesting reasons why she didn't do that. But again, this kind of challenged my assumptions about what all students might do or what all students would benefit from. So it was fascinating to get that depth of insight into individual cases. And I think without having gone through some sort of quite active research process, which in this case was lesson study, those particular issues might not have come about. So that is a very brief overview of some of the findings from the study. And now we've got a few questions which we would like to open out to you. And feel free to raise a question by putting on your microphone, or if you want to put a question or a comment into the chat box, that would be terrific. There are quite a few of us, I think, in the group, so let's try and keep our comments and questions relatively brief. But here are the questions we can think about. How might you apply a lesson study approach in your setting? And this is really important for this particular context. Are there ways of adapting this to an online context? if delivering online, what means might staff use to identify and respond to the very particular needs of individual students? So that's that kind of occluded area, whether this be with regards to assessment matters or perhaps more generally. And what other international research links might we engage with to strengthen inclusive practice? Okay, so I think rather than go through them 1 to 4, we'll just let you come with any questions or comments or observations on any that you are particularly interested in sharing.
Gareth, can I just kind of follow up on that?
Please do.
Yeah, just to kind of highlight some of the areas that you identified. And I think that issue around like both of the areas around digital literacy and digital poverty are really fascinating, as you identified, for particularly in light of this one student who one might have imagined was, you know, to the forefront in terms of the adoption of digital tools and whatever else. So, and through lesson study revealing that actually wasn't the case. I also want to kind of share that much of our perspective, particularly in light of drawing a holistic approach to the research in relation to the involvement of colleagues from right across the university, was informed by Universal Design for Learning in particular. So it's kind of this marrying of design processes with being mindful of individual requirements. But we have a colleague who wants to jump in, which is great. Over to yourself.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's an interesting presentation, Seán and Gareth. So I had a few questions really coming from how you implemented this lesson study. Were you, obviously, I appreciate that maybe you're doing it in a small scale, you know, with very particular focused learners with specific disabilities or needs. But how do you think this would be in scale up in terms of you know, looking at micro groups within this disabled learners, you know, those who belong to BME, for instance, you know, including that, you know, kind of intrinsic motivation factors, which relate to some of the social issues you were talking about. And, you know, I was thinking how that would marry into the kind of approach you're taking, and whether the framework which you have shown in your lesson study plan would really translate to other settings. You know, for instance, you have learners who have very diverse learning, you know, approaches. Whether our study plan is really, if you go by that kind of approach, whether that would really cater to these students as well with diverse learning abilities within the disabled learners, I mean. What are your thoughts on that? Sorry if it is a long question.
Well, no, it's a good question. I think we're just kind of playing with who'd like to jump in. But Gareth, go for it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. The lesson study asks the observers to identify beforehand, of course, a particular group or individuals whose engagement with the learning they want to find out more about. So yes, you could certainly, you could use this with whatever range or whichever set of groups you wish to do. What's important is that you're very clear about your focus when you start, because that's the important bit, is that you have a very clear focus about who you want to be observing and investigating with, and precisely what. Is it about their engagement in class activities? Is it about who they interact with? Is it about how in-class affects their work between class? So it's really important you have very clear focus, but certainly it could be applied to all sorts of settings, all sorts of subgroups at all sorts of levels. So yes.
Okay,
your question, Nagamani, about the scalability is an interesting one, but I think to some extent it's a unique approach that looks at and that recognizes the uniqueness of each learning environment. And I think that that's really what its primary focus is. is revealing what learner experiences are in particular contexts. So I think your identification of, for example, learners from BAME backgrounds could absolutely become a focus. I think one of the things that we took away from this as well is the empowerment element for the learners themselves. The three of the individuals that Gareth spoke about actually presented at an international conference afterwards. So they weren't only kind of bystanders who were looked at by the research group. And this is, I think, the difference between the application and lesson study, where it traditionally has looked at primary or elementary schools, particularly in Japan, and particularly for some reason in relation to mathematics. But taking that into a higher education context does necessitate a change, I think, in relation to how it is applied, and particularly in relation to learner voice and empowerment.
Thank you for that. I was wondering as well whether there was a further, whether the study went further into evaluating the feedback given by the, learners, how they took back the kind of lesson study plan and, went further into their experiences, sort of relating them to other contexts. Was any further study done?
Yeah, not so much study.
Sorry,
Gareth.
just to say, after each session, part of the feedback would be sitting down with the 3 students and exploring their experiences in more depth. And that's what gave us a lot of the really interesting kind of nitty-gritty data. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Really interesting.
It is. And we've got some interesting stuff happening in the chat function as well. So Nina, did you want to jump in? And I think we have about 5 minutes left, Kathy, if I'm not mistaken, but it'd be great to have Nina jump in just before that.
Hi there, thanks Sean, and thank you Gareth. I'm currently in the process of rewriting our peer review policy at the university, and I'm feeling quite inspired by lesson study. I just wondered to what extent colleagues had embraced it across Worcester, or if you know of any other HE institutions using it.
It's, I think the thing is that as with a lot of these changes, they're slow burns, aren't they? And they're getting picked up. So I think there is growing interest in the University of Worcester with lesson study. And as I mentioned, particularly the institutions, the international institution that was involved, and even additional institutions in Brazil have really taken lesson study to heart in terms of revealing what the learner experiences have been. Gareth, did you have a particular view on this?
Well, it's just interesting talking about the peer review process, because we've had, obviously we have a peer review process which is more or less active, depending on particular departments. But I think one of the things I took from this particular project was the use of people from outside your particular department, from outside of the academic department. So those student support departments, if you can get them involved, that really gives really interesting perspectives on what's going on.
Looks like we've got a very limited amount of time left, so we're just about to jump back, I think, into the other room. Gareth, do you want to take this summary back into the space?
Yes, I'll do that.
Excellent, good stuff. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Yeah.
And
yes,
do get in touch if you've any further questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will end the recording.